Welcome to the Safe House Podcast, a place where faith comes alive through real story of God's power and grace. I'm Dylan.
And I'm Reggie,
your co-hosts and fellow believers on this journey to share how God transforms lives. Each week, we'll open up about our own testimonies, what God has done in our lives, and invite others to do the same. Together, we'll explore stories of redemption, healing, and unshakable faith, all to spread the hope of the gospel. This is more than a podcast. It's a safe space where we celebrate God's work and remind each other that no matter where you are or what you've been through, His love is greater. So grab a seat and join the conversation, and let's dive into what makes the Safe House your refuge in Him. I always grew up religious, in a religious household, and I think it was probably around age 14 I decided to get baptized. I grew up going to a religious Adventist school. That's where I met Reggie. But it was shortly after I was baptized that I really started to kind of question everything with God. It was just a lot of back and forth in my head of worrying about how people viewed me, especially now that I had made this public, declaration, thank you, of my life was for Christ. And I started to just really stress over how Christians would view me now that I am baptized, and just how non-Christians would view me. Like, everybody's watching my life. And all of these thoughts would just really weigh me down, like always constantly worrying about, am I doing enough as a Christian, or what are people going to be thinking about me, like regardless of what I did. So it was shortly after that I really just kind of started to be like, I'm really kind of done with this. Like, I'm done with these constant battles in my head. Like, I just want to be done. Like, I just want to live my life. And that's kind of what I started doing, is just moving farther and farther away from God. I ended up leaving my private school and going to a public school. And like, even that was like, a whole new world of just like, wow, like I was always surrounded by people who believed in God. And then coming into this new environment where I was like, wow, like there's more to the world than I thought there was. And it was great. I was absolutely loving it. Like, that's when I started meeting all these new people, and really just kind of like, I started partying more, or just like even entering into the party scene, because like that was something that didn't exist at our private school. And that's when I was kind of like, okay, well, like, what do I need God for? Like, life is going so well right now. Like, what is, like, why do I even deal with all this inside turmoil? And so, like, that's when I kind of started to get farther and farther away from God. And, like, I was like, well, this is fine. Like, I don't have this condemnation in my head anymore. Like, I can just live my life how I want. And, like, things are going so great. And, like, I was really enjoying life at that time, like, going through high school. And, like, there wasn't any, like, crazy hardships. And that's kind of, like, when I just slowly started to, like, fade out of religion and, like, my relationship with God. Flash forward a couple of years, I still like don't really have a relationship with God, and I get my first like serious adult relationship. And like, even then, like, things were still going good, but like, that's when everything really started to change in my life. There was a lot of just difficult things we went through in the relationship. Like, you were there for a lot of it. And like, a lot of people, like a lot of my close friends, were worried about how much I was putting myself into the relationship, and like, what am I getting out of it? But for me, like, she had a horrible, or just a really difficult at-home life. Her parents had split up when she was young, and she lived with her mom and her stepdad. And like, that was just a really difficult home situation. And so like, as her and I were going through that, like, that was like one of our biggest like stress points, was just like her getting along with her family and me getting along with her family as well. And that was like one of the biggest things that was like just a struggle throughout our entire relationship together. But she ended up moving out of her mom's and like moved in with her aunts, which was really good. Like, it seemed like, okay, like that's finally kind of over with. And that was really good, until as time went on, her mom was like, oh, like, why don't you move back? Like, things have been going really well between us. Like, why don't you try moving back? Ultimately, she did end up moving back, and that things were going okay until they weren't again. Like, it was just kind of like the same repetitive cycle. And like, her aunt had told my ex, or my girlfriend at the time, that, like, okay, like, I can't really do this again. Like, if you move out, then you're done. Like, I can't really, change my whole house again and like make room for you. So flash forward another couple months as, things aren't going well again, and she ends up moving in here. And it wasn't like, things had gotten much worse over there, that it was not necessarily, it was never really the healthiest relationship, but it was getting to the point where it's like, okay, like things need to change. And she didn't have anywhere to go, so she ended up moving in here with me and my dad and my brother. And like that was a really, difficult time as well, because it wasn't like we had talked about it and like planned it out, like, oh yeah, like you can just move in here, like
it's very sudden.
Yeah, it'll be fine. And that was just like a quick change that, we had to adapt to. And like there was plenty of other things like throughout a relationship that was just really, really difficult, but we were able to get through them. And I was like, wow, like, our relationship's really strong, like getting through all these challenges. But probably one of the biggest things that was one of our struggling points is at a young age, she was diagnosed with PCOS. Which is kind of just an umbrella category for like, it's going to be really, really hard to get pregnant. And that was kind of like one of the first make it or break it conversations that we had, is like when she told me she had PCOS, and like she was terrified to tell me in the beginning of our relationship, because she knew having kids was something that I really wanted in my future. And, doctors her entire life kind of telling her like, yeah, that's probably not really going to happen. So it was really difficult for her to tell me that she had PCOS. And I remember her career choice at that time was she wanted to be a flight attendant. And in my head, I was like, that's not really something I want in a relationship. Like, you just be gone all the time. So kind of like one of the first, make or break conversations we had was we sat down and I was like, look, like, I'll support you going and being a flight attendant, like if you can promise like at some point we'll actually like try and have kids. Like that was kind of like, and then we came to the agreement like, okay, like yeah, we can do this. She ended up not wanting to be a flight attendant, started going to school for biology. But flash forward towards the end of our relationship, she ended up getting pregnant. And so at this point in my life, this was the biggest curveball that had ever been thrown my way. We both thought it was pretty much impossible. And like we had done a bunch of research into PCOS and like all the work it was going to have to be to like even just try and make it possible. And then this happened. And I remember the day she told me, I'd come home from work, and it was the most excited, but also the most terrified I've ever felt all at once. Of just sitting there, and the pregnancy test, she had taken 5 of them because she thought, oh, maybe it was wrong, and just kept trying. And I remember just looking at her, trying to read every one of her body cues of what she wanted me to say or do in this in this situation. Because a lot of our relationship was, I realize now, just trying to fix everything. And so we talked about it for a couple of weeks of just like, what are we going to do? And ultimately we decided to get an abortion. And that is when I started just kind of disassociating from life. Like I was just so worried about how I could take care of her, what she wanted and like what she wanted to do in this situation, that I never really looked at what I wanted. And so I remember after we did the procedure, she fell into a really bad depression. Like kind of just laid in my bed all the time and just kind of slept. And I was just like, how can I make this better? Like, how can I, support her through this? And things seemed like they were starting to get better. Like she was able to like start going to work again. And like, she was laughing again. Like it seemed like things were going back to normal, or as normal as they could be after a situation like that. And 3 weeks after we got the abortion, she ended up breaking up with me. And at that point, that's when I hit rock bottom. That's when I could finally process everything that had been going on, because I was in such a mode of just trying to fix the situation I was in without, really focusing on myself. I was just always wondering, like, How is she doing? How can I fix this situation? Like, I hate that she feels this way. And, you know, the few people I have told about the abortion previous to this, you know, all of them tried to tell me that, you know, oh, well, it's not your fault. Like, you didn't really have control over it. But for me personally, like, knowing that I never really spoke my truth and been like, yeah, I wish I would have done more in the past. And so, like, I'll never fully accept that, you know, oh, it was completely out of my control when I didn't do anything to the best of my ability to, like, really try and speak my truth. And so, like, I will never, ever fully blame her for it through all of that. I will never say it was just her choice.
Yeah, you told me that you were in the relationship. It was kind of like you had her and you were okay not having God because you had her. And I think that's probably why you had that reaction that you did.
Yeah.
You know?
I mean, at that point in my life, like, she was my God. Like, I was perfectly okay not having to have a relationship with God because I didn't see the point. I was like, I don't get it. Like, I have everything I thought I wanted at that time. I was like, okay, I have the relationship. Like, I'm building my career. Like, what do I really need God for? Like, and she had her own troubles with religion.
Yeah.
Because with her growing up, and her dad was a real big Jehovah's Witness. And just what was portrayed to her as a kid and what religion stood for to her because of the experience she had through a kid growing up was so twisted from what it's actually supposed to be that she wanted absolutely nothing to do with it. And I was like, okay, well, if you want nothing to do with religion, then what do I need it for? Like, I have you. Like, all right, no big deal. But yeah, she ended up breaking up with me, and like, I was saying, you know, my whole life was put around her. Like, it was like, okay, like, you know, I was going to finish my master's by the time she finished her bachelor's, and she was planning to get her master's degree, and it was like, okay, I'll wait to start my career depending on, like, what master's program she gets in, and then I can worry about my career. And then obviously, like, it was like my whole identity was completely shattered when she broke up with me. It was like, I don't even know what I'm trying for in life anymore. And that's just like the 2 weeks following after the breakup grief was pretty much the only emotion I could feel. Between, the breakup and the abortion and just all of that eating away at me and being like, why am I even here? Like, really just, I had never felt anything like this, where it was like, I couldn't even remember what it felt like to be happy. During those 2 weeks, like, I had stopped eating. Like, I lost almost 12 pounds just because I would just lay in bed and just, didn't see the purpose in anything. Just absolute rock bottom. And like, I could barely go to work. I had taken time off just to try and get my head straight, because my thought process is like, I didn't want to drink or smoke or do anything because I knew it was only just going to, like, mask the problem, because I knew I was in such bad shape, and I really just wanted to, like, sit and self-isolate and try and figure out how to even process everything, like, in a healthy way, to just, like, get away from this feeling of grief, because I was like, I don't like this at all. Like, it was absolutely consuming me to the point where it's like, I didn't even feel the need to eat. Like, really just didn't know where to go in life.
Yeah, I remember we went disc golfing.
Yeah.
And we, like, didn't say a word.
Yeah.
The whole time.
Like, and that was was just so weird to me, is like, I'm normally this person who, like, can walk into a room and I'm like, oh, hey, like, you know, I have no problem talking to anybody. And it was just like, any social setting I was in, I would just be done after like 10 minutes. And just like, I would look like I wanted, you know, didn't want to be there. Like, I would just look absolutely miserable. And I remember it was, really bad 2 weeks. And like, I decided to sign up for therapy because I was like, I'm so out of my depth here. And it was shortly after that, that's when I had my encounter with God, was when I invited you over shortly after. And I mean, even then, like, you came over and we were playing Settlers of Catan. And like, even then, like, I'm sure like you guys were like, yeah, he's not fully here right now.
I know. I could tell you were grieving, man. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was hard.
But yeah,
Honestly, I was praying for you like crazy. I didn't know what to say. I was just like trusting, man. Honestly, just
yeah.
trusting God. He had it in control.
And
But
he absolutely did. But that night after we played a couple of games of Catan, I don't even know how we really got on the topic, but we ended up talking about religion and just everything. Like, I was kind of just saying everything that was going through my head with everything that I was feeling, and then we get on the topic of religion, and I remember we talked for probably like 4 hours about it.
yeah,
And I remember the whole time, like, I was just like, yeah, no, like,
till like
this
2 in the
doesn't check out.
morning.
Yeah. And like, the biggest argument that I gave was, statistically, like, I believe there is a God, a higher power that created everything. Like, that was my argument. I was like, statistically, yeah, the way things are designed, like, there has to be a higher power that created everything. And like, I was like, I'm not going to say that the God of Christianity is that's the right one. I was like, there's so many other religions out there that talk about this. And I was like, yeah, like, I was fine living my life and being like, okay, like, the deal I told myself that I made with God was that, I'm going to start living life my way. If anybody asks you if I believe in God, I'll say, yeah, I believe in God, but I'm still going to live life how I want to live it, which is a real dangerous place to be. So,
Yeah, I remember you telling me that.
yeah, but that was like the deal I made with God. I was like, all right, when judgment day comes, like, you send me to heaven or hell, like, I'm not going to be upset. Like, I lived my life how I wanted. And that's like how I was making peace with it, because I was so tired of all the inside turmoil in my head.
Sadly, is a lot of people today.
Yeah. It's a really dangerous place to be. But I mean, I remember you and I like debated for several hours that night. And I remember I never wanted to have these conversations with you because I was so worried that I was going to shake your faith and like be like, oh, okay, like, this guy, like, he's found something good. Like, I don't want to like ruin that hope with him and be like, yeah, dude, I actually don't believe anything you're saying.
I remember you saying that.
But that was like a real fear that
I enjoy. I told you, I was like, no, this is like, I think we should question, I think it's important because it can actually grow our faith through that questioning. And whenever you're become scared at how big the question is, that's when I think it gets easy to start doubting, I guess.
Yeah.
But I think everyone, I mean, every Christian goes through periods of questioning,
Yeah,
It's not like
you just figure it out all of a sudden one day.
you're not on the mountaintop all the time, every day, but
yeah,
you become stronger through that,
Absolutely. But I do remember, like, probably the only thing I remember from the conversation is, when you were leaving, is like 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. or something, and it was like, all right, like, it's time for bed now. But like, the last thing you said, like, as you were giving a hug to me while you were leaving, was like, you've been trying it your way for so long, like, why don't you give God a chance? Like, look where doing your own thing has gotten you. And that's when I was kind of like,
I almost didn't say that too. I thought about saying that, and before I did, and then I prayed, and I'm like, I have to say this. I have to say this, and then I did, and I'm so happy I did. But that was all God, man.
and it's funny because the night you said that, I remember I walked into my room and I was just laying down and I was like, this is the first time I don't feel just complete grief.
Mhm.
And I was like, what is this? I was like, yeah, it was great seeing you and like getting to spend time with friends, but I'd been trying to do that and like I still felt like crap afterwards. And I remember just laying down in my bed and sitting there and just being like, this feels real. So I prayed that night for the first time I had prayed in years. I was like, look, God, I'm done. Like, I got nothing left. And I said, please help me. And that's when I felt the most immense amount of peace I've ever felt in my life. And I hadn't felt anything but grief for 2 weeks straight, almost. And calling it peace, like, it doesn't even come close to what I was feeling. It was like all the weight I had been carrying was completely gone. And I just remember being like, wow, that was crazy. And it was during that night,
It
that
was
that night,
the change in you after a week after that. It was a miracle, man. Yeah. Ever since then, it's been a miracle. I don't know, like, I think I told you this, but I had been praying for you like every day. I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't know what God was going to do through your relationship, but I am just thankful that I'm thankful that he uses all things for his good, through
yeah.
this experience.
And I just remember, that night was also like the first night I had actually slept through the whole night. Because a lot of those 2 weeks was just me falling asleep for like an hour or two and then having some nightmare of like her, coming back and just reliving the breakup of like her breaking up with me or like her coming back and being like, oh, I've been sleeping with all these guys. And like, it was just this constant cycle of waking up, reliving the nightmare, and just like my anxiety was just going crazy. And like, I wasn't really sleeping. Like, it was just constant wake up, go through these cycles, fall back asleep after finally getting exhausted, falling asleep for an hour or two. And that was kind of just where my head was at. And during that night, I actually slept through the whole night. And so I woke up the next morning being like, okay, I was like, did all of that really happen last night? And I was like, I immediately went to start doubting because I was like, maybe I've like snapped, like maybe I'm a little bit crazy now, like going through all of this, all this loss, all this grief, and like really just, I could feel when I'd be like sitting and self-isolating when my brain would be just like kind of like turn off and be like, okay, that's like enough, like you're done, like here's like a little dopamine to like feel normal.
Calm me down. Yeah.
But I remember waking up the next morning and being like, okay, like what was all of that, and just being like, really just kind of opened the door where I was like, okay, all of that felt really real and absolutely insane. But I was like, maybe I've just lost it. Maybe my mental sanity is just snapped and I'm just, completely living in a different reality now where I'd went from not believing in God at all and like not wanting anything to do with him to being like, wow, like, man, maybe God really is real. Like maybe there's a way crazier purpose to life than just, living and dying. And so I started to really kind of have these questions and I just started praying more often. And like one of the biggest things is like my mind state was still really just under a lot of attack with me even just getting to trust my own judgment. But also just like anxiety and just like, oh, how is she doing? And just like all these thoughts of like trying to figure out how to go through all of it. And I just remember I'd start praying anytime I had like these really negative thoughts of like, oh, like I bet she's just sleeping with all these people or just doing all these things. And I would just pray and those thoughts would go away. Like the weight of those thoughts would just go away. I'd be like, God, like take this away. And, because I was so analytical, I was like, I have to like make sure these prayers are going to keep working every single time. I was like, one time, yeah, okay, I can sum it up as chance. But I remember I did it every single time that day. And every single time, it was just gone as soon as I said the prayer. And, I think God absolutely has to have a sense of humor, especially when my whole argument to you that night was, statistically speaking, I'm not going to believe in God. And God was absolutely listening on that conversation. Because ever since that night, and I started to, pray more and just like really look into God more, the events that happened in my life following that night, there is no way that statistically all of these crazy things could have happened. I mean, I remember you'd been trying to get me to go to your young adults group for
college group.
Yeah, college group for I don't even know how long. And I was just kind of like, all right, like, I guess I'll try and go and just see what happens. Because I was like, all right, like, I'm at least going to give this a shot, like, and see what's going on. And I remember I was driving to finally go meet up. And I was, like, worried because I was like, man, like, social settings are still really hard for me. Like, I can't really function in social settings without, being miserable. And I remember just driving and, like, I was trying to, like, I was just asking God, I was praying to him, and like, I was still in a really low spot. Like, I remember just being like, please, like, whatever I'm supposed to hear tonight, like, please, 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 like, let it be what's supposed to guide me tonight. And I just remember praying, like, as I'm crying, like, driving, like, doing this prayer. And it was like almost immediately, he's like, you're not done suffering yet. And I went from straight crying to just like laughing. I'm like, what kind of answer is that? Like, I'm not done suffering yet. I was like, I'm already doing, like, I'm pleading here. Like, I need you. Like, I need your help. And like, I'm not done suffering. And like, I just started cracking up. And then I go and meet this guy at our meetup spot. And it was Labor Day. And he goes, hey, man, like, forgot to mention, like, there's actually not going to be a sermon tonight. Like, it's just going to be like a trivia night. That's funny.
Oh, great. I could really use a message right now.
I really could have used a message, tonight to really just kind of like guide me on like what I'm supposed to be doing here. But we talked back and forth, and you were like, well, do you even still want to go? And I was like, I don't know, man. Like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do right now. Long story short, like, we ended up showing up, and I can remember just walking in there and not feeling like the weight I normally felt when I'd be going into social settings. And I was like, wow, like, this is weird. Like, I remember after like the first 10 minutes went by, and I was like, I actually still feel fine. And just like being in that environment again after I'd spent so much time away from it, I was like, wow, this feels good. Like, this feels right. Like, just being in a social setting again and being able to just be okay, I was like, wow, just really bizarre. And I was like, okay. But crazy things just started happening during those 2 weeks when I was like, okay, God, like, let's see what is going to go on. So yeah, that's when things started getting crazy, and it could only be God with the things that were happening in my life. The biggest thing that I started feeling like I needed to do was tell my story and not be afraid anymore, because that was the biggest thing that stopped me when I was a Christian as a child, was I was so afraid of what people would think about me if I started saying, like, I believe in God. And then that was something that I really just started doing, was just telling people my story. And the 2 weeks after I'd really started giving God my life again was just insane. I had people that I hadn't talked to in years text me and be like, oh, well, hey, how you doing, man? Like, how's life? And I'm like, okay, well, yeah, guess what? Like, I'm not in a relationship anymore. And like, this is everything that's happened. And just started sharing my story and like get to encourage people that were Christians, and just like, like you said, that transformation that you could see from like who I was to who I am now was like the biggest, affirmation that I got from everybody, was just like, dude, like, they didn't know I was Christian or like anything like that. Or even people that, I've
People
talked
who
to.
didn't know you. Eddie, for example, met you on my birthday, and I didn't know that was like a couple days before that you guys had broken up. And then, but from that interaction with you, from Eddie's perspective to, I think we rode down to college group once together, and after, it was later that night, he's like, wow, Dylan seems different. He's like, something about him has changed.
Uh-huh.
And I'm like, yeah, I just told him like about your reawakening of your faith, but just another testament.
Yeah. And like that was just one of the resounding themes. And it's only because of God that me and who I am today is only because of God. Because I really think, if those events never happened, I would have lived my life being okay, not knowing God.
Yeah.
And I really think those events had to happen as much as I hated them and going through it all. Like the fact that I can even talk about these things and I can now share my story and be a light to others that have maybe gone through the same experiences. Like this is what it was all for, because people that have gone through these same things, like, but aren't or are going to be able to relate. Like, whereas you haven't gone through these things, and like, yeah, you can see and like I can tell my story, but it's not going to hit the same.
No, I can't empathize, but I can sympathize with
Yeah.
you.
And it was just so cool to see from me telling my story and just getting to encourage, other Christians, or just even it opened the door for me to share what God has done in my life with people who aren't Christians. And like the biggest thing that it was obvious was at work for me. And like the first instance was there was this night that I wasn't supposed to work and one of my other coworkers wasn't supposed to work. And it was just this crazy thing that was all thrown together last minute with people calling out, and just like, I was like, all right, I'll come into work. And she was just really having a bad day that day. And we were just started talking, and I kind of just mentioned something to do with religion. And she was like, what? Like, I didn't even know you were religious. But she ended up sharing with me that during the time I found out that I was pregnant, she ended up sharing with me that she ended up praying for me. And she said that she never felt like the urge to like ever pray for somebody. But she prayed the exact same thing as you, where it was like, I hope Dylan finds a way back to God. And like the time she said that prayer was literally almost the exact day that she was pregnant. And it was like, there was so many things that started happening. Like I started going to therapy, as I said earlier, but it was during like my second session with my therapist that she started sharing some of her story with me. And I found out that she was religious as well. Which is just another crazy, like, one-off chance. Like, when I started going to therapy...
Yeah, God was looking out.
Yeah. Like, they ask you, like, 10 questions to, like, assess, like, your trauma, like, what it is you're going through. So not only was my therapist Christian, but she also lived close to me. And it's like, okay, like, oh, another one-off chance. Like, just really like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But that following 2 weeks, I worked with a bunch of different of my coworkers, and every single day religion was brought up. And I was like, okay, God, like, I guess this is a sign. Like, I'm just going to share my story and, like, see what happens. Like, I'm not going to...
Yeah, you kept telling me about it, and I'm like, whoa.
It was
told
like...
your coworkers? Like, wow. It was, like, made me reevaluate myself. And I'm like, wow, I am not as bold as I should be. And then it was just super encouraging to me too, to hear that. But
And yeah, there was just so many instances like that where I was like, okay, that's funny, God. Like, yeah, statistically, like, this couldn't check out. And I remember another thing that hit me real hard is my mom had given me this book 2 years ago or something for Christmas, and then that's when she like knew I wasn't really a Christian. But it was this book called Killing Lions, and it's just kind of how to be a man, grow into be like a man through Christ. And on the opening page, she had wrote like, please don't throw this away. Like, you'll never know when you might need it someday. Which was just crazy that I was just like kind of like looking at my bookshelf, and like that book just caught my eye, and I decided to open it. And it was dated like 2022 or something. And for that to just, during this full, 2 weeks of just like crazy one-off instances happening, and it was like, yeah, you're going to see all this and still tell me, like, say that God doesn't exist with all of these things happening. And it was just insane, like all this evidence of just like, wow, like God really did have a plan for it all. And like something else that was really cool, like I shared with you, like my therapist was like, oh, this book that really helped me was like the Daily Devotional by, do you remember who it was by?
Daily Bread?
No, it was the really famous one.
Author?
Yeah, I can't remember her name. I have it in my room. I'd have to go look at it. But she was like, yeah, she was sharing to me, like just some of the hardships she went through and like how that book was really helpful to her. But that was the same book your mom gave me for my 8th grade graduation.
Oh my gosh, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was just another crazy, like, oh, okay. And it's just like all of these things, from my past coming back, and just like from all the conversations I was even able to have with people. And it was like, okay, like this is just crazy one-off chances. And I remember even sharing with like some of our friends, like just with all the coincidences that were happening, and they were like, yeah, like you're crazy.
Yeah.
You've lost it. And like I was okay with that. I was like,
yeah, then you're asking me, and we're like, am I crazy, man? Do I sound crazy? I'm like a little bit, but it's good. It's a good crazy.
Yeah. And I mean, I think there's some saying where it's like, God will do these things, like the really crazy things, when there is nobody else you can give credit to but to him.
Yeah.
And like, yeah, everything that's been going in my life, like that's why I felt led to try and start this podcast, was that I didn't want to be fearful anymore. I wanted to share my story. And so that's really the biggest goal of this podcast. That's why you and I are sitting here now, is to just share my story, and God will do the rest.
Yeah, it's crazy you mentioned that. I was just listening to a sermon today talking about how God uses ordinary people to do crazy things because of that same thing, like to show that it was only him, that could do this, work through them.
Yeah. And that's been like one of my favorite sayings that I've been repeating to myself over and over and over again is, God qualifies the called. He doesn't call the qualified.
That's it. Yeah.
And like, man, here we are, and anything that happens, like if anything at all happens with this podcast, like it is only going to be because God willed it to be that way.
Yeah.
And that's something I completely believe in. And I am just so grateful that, I was able to go through those things and have these people around me that were praying for me to find God, and I have. But all of it is only because God was looking out for me every step of the way, even when I turned my back on him. And that was something that was made so evident to me through my relationship with my girlfriend, of just when she broke up with me, it was, I love her so much that I can forgive her and move on, but I still wanted to have that relationship with her. And like, isn't that how God views all of us? Is that he loves us so much and wants to have a relationship with us so much, but so many of us want absolutely nothing to do with him. And like, that really kind of like broke me a little bit to realize like, wow, like he loves us that much, but like so many of us want absolutely nothing to do. And it like really put it in perspective for me of where like I was walking away. I was like, he loves me so much. And it was just like all of that just came pouring in, and really like just went, I went like, wow, like this is insane.
That's so weird. Yeah. Like what she was doing to you, you were doing to God.
Yeah.
And then now you're able to realize, like, oh,
And like that has also been one of the other biggest things is when she broke up with me, I was like, I don't have a purpose anymore. Like my whole identity was, supporting her, like building our life together, trying to get that started. Um, and when she left, it was, I didn't know who I was. And I didn't know what my purpose was supposed to be. But as I started sharing my story with people, like that is when I feel the most fulfilled. Like sharing my story, sharing what God has done in my life.
yeah.
That's when I feel I've had the most purpose that I've ever felt in my life, the most fulfilled I could ever imagine. And it's only because of God.
Well, that's what he calls us to do.
And
Yeah.
it was just, everything has been so crazy from when I was literally just at that most broken point of my life, and just how quickly it's only been 3 months and how quickly everything has completely flipped. Where I feel like I know what my purpose is. I know what I'm doing. I know God again. I know how much he loves me. And just from being in that completely broken place to where I am now, like I am beyond grateful just to the relationships I've been able to start creating with people that I didn't even think I was going to be able to meet. Because that was also one of like my biggest fears when I was just kind of self-isolating, is like, how am I going to meet anybody? Like my social circle is so small. Like I go to an online master's program, like I'm not meeting anybody there.
Yeah.
And I was like, I work at Starbucks, and like I work with the majority of like just teenagers. And I was like, okay, like my life's done. Like I am chalked up. And like that was just that negative mind space I was in. But as I've started, walking with God more, and just like the amount of people I've met, and even just the relationships I already have with people, how much stronger and how much more meaningful they've become, because, I've started to put God into the conversation, and just realizing, man, like even with my non-Christians friends, it's like, man, I hope I get to see you in heaven. There's so much more purpose when, you just have those talks with them, and it's like, man, like, I really hope I get to see you in heaven. And just like that kind of being like the underlying mission of like, how can I show God's love to them?
Yeah.
And like, even just with other Christians, it's like, man, like, it's just so cool to build these kind of connections where you can share with each other, like where you're struggling, and just like how you can help them. Like even just with my story, like,
Honestly, that thought of will this person be in heaven, like, and how can I do my part? How can God work through me to help me try to, get them there? And that was part of what drove me. Like, I had that thought when I was telling you that night, and I imagined you not being there in heaven with me, man. And I was like, no, yeah, I have to say this. And that's really what kind of, that gave me a lot of power to do that.
absolutely. And, like I said earlier, like whatever's going to happen with this podcast, like that's what's going to happen. Like if it succeeds, it's up to God. And, if it fails, then I've already learned so much about myself and just about God. And so none of it's a waste.
Yeah, well, also, like, none of us are coming on here trying to be experts on the Bible, or honestly, all we can do is share our stories right now, because that is part of what the Bible tells us, and also I think that's what's so beautiful about the gospel message, is how Jesus takes ordinary men and does extraordinary things with them.
But yeah, I think that's going to wrap it up for episode 1. Thank you guys for listening. Make sure to share. And yeah, if you guys would love to come on and share your story with the podcast, you can reach out on any of our social media, and we would absolutely love to have you guys on. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.